Hey all, it's Yogi, and we're being a little out of character today. Rather than nerding out on science as we normally do, today we're going to nerd out on history, specifically protests throughout history. This is on many people's minds right now, so I felt it was important to address. Let me be clear about one thing. I have no intention to speak on behalf of black people. There's plenty of black voices for you to be listening to, and I encourage you to go out and find them. Maybe they're black authors, maybe they're black people on social media, maybe they're somebody you know personally and you've avoided that uncomfortable conversation. Let me encourage you to pursue that uncomfortable conversation. If your intentions are good, then you have nothing to be concerned about. Admit what you don't know, admit your own curiosities and shortcomings, and I assure you, people will open up to you and you'll be better for it. Today, we're talking about protests, demonstrations, revolt, revolutions, strikes, even riots, whatever you want to call it. Civil unrest of many people gathering together to express their discontent, that's putting it lightly, with a situation. That could range anywhere from peaceful gatherings to marches, people with signs, chanting, civil disobedience like sit-ins, blocking traffic, etc. Maybe even escalating through destruction of property. Over the past thousands of years, there have been countless examples of protest. And my message today, above all else, is that the lifestyle that we live today was made possible by the people who have protested who came before us. We owe them a debt of gratitude. The theme amongst nearly all protests is that it's a tool of the oppressed to fight authority. And whether you start from ancient Egypt, the Byzantine Empire, the Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, thousands of years ago, you had a civilization in which there was one person with concentrated power who ruled over a very large portion of land. You could go live in the middle of nowhere. There was no guarantee that the henchman of some king or pharaoh or emperor was going to show up and tell them that they owed the king a debt. The first protest that I'd like to focus on was called the Peasants' Revolt, and it occurred across England in 1381. It was effectively a rise against serfdom. See, in medieval Europe, kings and queens reigned over kingdoms, and within those kingdoms, parcels of lands, or fiefs, were given to families for them to work on. Serfs were effectively slave. In fact, the word serf and the word slave come from the same Latin root. And like a slave, a serf could be sold along with the land, they could be legally abused, and they needed permission to marry. And you can bet that the rulers took whatever size portion they wanted in terms of taxes or the crops. So there's this one serf, his name's Wat Tyler, and the poll tax collector comes to his house, and part of the job of the collector is to calculate the tax owed based on the number of adults that live there. As legend has it, it is a 650-year-old story. In order to determine if Tyler's daughter was an adult, he needed to determine if she reached the age of puberty, and the tax collector started undressing her. So Tyler kills the tax collector on the spot. And then soon after, Tyler is risen to the leader of the forces from Kent, which are marching on London. And around the same time, peasants from all across the country are doing the same. He partners up with this rebellious priest named John Ball. This story is partially told in the Canterbury Tales, although it's fictionalized. But again, 650 years old, it's hard to know exactly what the story is. The story alleges that Tyler was killed by the mayor of London, and that ultimately King Richard II met some of the demands of the peasants. Somewhere between 100 and 200 years later, serfdom no longer exists in England. And that's notable because most of the rest of Europe doesn't start to phase out serfdom until the Enlightenment and the French Revolution in the mid-1700s. The concept of serfdom, which is the functional exploitation of feudalism, was spread from Western Europe all over the world, and it lasted much longer in some other places. It lasted in Eastern Europe and Russia until the 1860s, Bosnia until the end of World War I in 1918, Afghanistan in 1923, and it was debatedly even in Tibet and parts of China until 1959. If I need to remind you why people protest, it's to fight overly authoritative rule. And what kind of people are overly authoritative? Well, take for example that Pope Alexander VI, who 2 years after Columbus discovered America, he divided the world in half. Half for the Catholic Church to rule, and half for the non-Catholic countries led by Portugal. Compare that similar action to in the Middle East in the early 1900s, the Sykes-Picot Treaty that cut up the Middle East regardless of who lived where and what tribes of people were peaceful with what other tribes are warring. And a lot of people would argue that that treaty, led by the English and the French, has led to the issues that we have in the Middle East today. The versions of history that we're taught often have the bad habit of glossing over the dirty details, like most stories about the Pilgrims, for instance. The story you were likely told went something like, we want to have religious freedom, so we're going to go to the new lands of America where we can have that. This glosses over the hundreds of years of unrest in England, where they punished people with fines and imprisonment for not being model parishioners in the Church of England, and that the Pilgrims actually went to Holland before they went to the Americas because they left in such a hurry, fearing for their lives. In France, in 1598, there was the Edict of Nantes, which was issued to separate civil unity from religious unity. And this was a major step forward for tolerance. Perhaps this led to the Enlightenment, which was a huge step forward for humankind. This led to the rejection of monarchies and the rule of the church. Many consider René Descartes saying, I think, therefore I am, along with the scientific work of Isaac Newton, to being the foundation of the Enlightenment. The advancement of science paved the way for individuals to demand individual rights and freedoms, and that no one was born with a divine right to rule, as monarchies had been based upon. I'm not going to tell you about the rebellious birth of the United States. That could take an hour on its own, and I believe that you've got a pretty good idea already. So let's talk about protests once we were an established country. In upstate New York, Dutch landowner Kilian van Rensselaer set up a manor system for farmers to own and work on subparcels of land. It echoes a bit of feudalism, honestly. However, he and his descendants were largely lenient and benevolent towards their renters, seeing that they could be both benevolent and profitable. That functioned pretty well from 1630 through 1839, when the last benevolent patroon, this is what the landowners were called, of the Rensselaer family died, and his heirs started going around trying to collect long-owed debts in full. 700 farmers revolted, and partially because they costumed themselves as the local indigenous Calico tribe, overtook the sheriff and a 500-man posse. The mayor of New York, Silas Wright, saw that something had to change. So he moved to slaughter the indigenous Calico people and outlaw disguises. I'm speechless. Many of the revolting farmers were found guilty at trial. The next mayor of New York, a couple years later, he pardoned many of them, and in 1846, the New York State Constitution added protections for renters and abolished feudal tenures. So there's this recurring theme, right? That people who are born into wealth exploit that wealth against those who weren't. So in the 1800s, there were dozens of riots over money and economics. You have banks that would literally close and not give people their money. The Baltimore Bank Riot of 1835 is the best example I have for you. But the FDIC wouldn't be established for another 100 years until after the Great Depression. There were many riots over instances in which the few controlled the local economy and exploited it. And they would artificially control the prices by withholding supply of stock. That happened in the Flour Riot of 1837, the Bread Riot of 1864, and the Mitcham War of 1890. And then we come on to the fact that there's massive amounts of protests for workers' rights. And these are perhaps the ones that are the most clear in their connection to our day-to-day lives today. They established minimum wage laws, regular working hours, workplace safety requirements. Look up the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. It was really awful. Locked doors, unsafe conditions, and many people died. And began projects to improve tenement slums in cities and establishment of holidays. That there's certain days that, are federal holidays. Just a small portion of the protests worth noting are the Tompkins Square Park riot in New York City, 1874, the Great Railroad Strike of 1880, the Haymarket Affair in 1886, the Bayview Massacre, 1886, the Pullman Strike in 1894, the Coeur d'Alene in 1900, which established unions for mine workers, the Indianapolis streetcar strike, the Ludlow Massacre, the Everett Massacre, aka Bloody Sunday, the Loray Mill Strike in 1929, the Ford Hunger March in Dearborn, Michigan in 1932, huge towards the establishment of unions. So appreciate if you have a job or your family members have jobs in which they are safe, work a reasonable number of hours, and get fair pay, amongst other things. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention protests having to do with race and civil rights, and we're well familiar with the protests of the 1960s, and I encourage you that there's always more to learn about them, so go and read more. What I want to note here is that the police in the 1960s were pretty exclusively on the side of the segregationists, on the side against the black people who were working for black rights. So imagine how those riots went from 1865, when slavery was abolished, until the 1960s. They weren't more peaceful. There was lots of conflicts between the black and the Irish throughout the 1900s. Technically, black men were given the right to vote in 1870, but many stipulations still applied, and that would take many, many years to resolve, and some people would argue that that's not fully resolved today. Police, too, have protested, as they have the right to do when they're not being compensated fairly for their efforts. Most specifically, I'll refer to the New York City police riots of 1857. Are you glad that you, a woman, can vote? Thank the suffragettes who fought for that from 1903 to 1918, 15 years. Are you glad that you, a woman who's less than 30 and you don't own land, can vote? You can thank the suffragettes who kept that fight going from 1918 to 1928, another 10 years, to get women's rights to be equal to the voting rights of men at the time, and respect to the women who fight for women's rights till today. Are you glad that you, a woman who isn't white, gets to vote? Well, you can thank everybody who kept that fight going until 1965, when black women gained the right to vote. 1965. I would be remiss if I didn't mention protests having to do with the rights of the LGBTQ community. The Stonewall riots in 1969 in New York City were a major step forward. If you're not familiar, they were triggered by cops who were shutting down bars and beating and arresting people for being gay. I think it goes without saying that the LGBTQ fight continues today. I would be remiss if I didn't mention protests of people fighting drafts into war, such as Vietnam, or people who protest fighting wars on principle, regardless of if there's not a draft, including the war in Iraq in 2003. All of this is just focusing on the United States. Notable protests have happened recently in Egypt, Russia, and Iran. And you might think that they have little to do with you, but I'd argue that all protests have a shared purpose, a shared spirit to express the unity of all humans and the equality of all humans and the resistance against oppression. So this video is dedicated to all the people who see a protest and say, I don't understand, why do they have to be protesting? Why can't they go about it in another way? Why does there have to be so much drama? Those people, I ask you, do you understand how much protest has happened in order for you to have the nice, comfortable life that you have that puts you in a position to ask that question? There's been a lot of protest. We're not done. Everyone's not there yet. So, that's it for today. Be nice to each other. Support people who need help. If a friend of yours said, help, help, I'm being oppressed, or even if some random white person said that to you, I feel like you'd believe them. So why don't you believe millions of people who are saying the same? Think about that. Don't forget the struggle. Don't forget the streets. One love.